Alright, we are going to look at the last part of this review with domain and range and graphing the points. Sorry that their video cut off. So first and foremost, we have two ways of writing the domain and range. We can either use interval notations, which are going to use our parentheses and our brackets, or we're going to use our inequalities, where we have our x or y, depending on whether it's domain or range. Remembering domain is x and range is y. And then we'll have our inequalities. It's either going to be our less than or equal to symbol, or just our less than, again depending on whether it's an open circle or a closed circle. And then we'll have our minimum and maximum value. So the lowest it goes, let's say, is -1, the highest it goes is 5 or something like that. Remember what the parentheses versus the brackets mean. So the parentheses means you have that open circle, or you have the infinity, because there is no end. So either it does not include it, or there is no end. The bracket means that we actually have a closed dot, where there is an ending point in sight. Okay? So that's when we're going to use each of those. Okay, so the other way, and these are the interval notation and inequality, is used when you have a line. So for instance, all of these three. When we only have points, remember we're going to state those points just out in order. So for our x's, remember our domain goes with our x values. I'm just going to put a D here to represent domain. So our domain for this first one, we're going to look at all of our x values that it uses. So this x is a -4. We can imagine putting a line there. So that x is a -4. And I'm going to go in order from least to greatest. So then we have a -2. Then we have 2 1s. Only we don't have to write it twice. We can just write it once. And then there's a 3. So those are all of our x values. Then we have our y values, which is our range. Let me do that with pink. So those are going to be our left and right, so our up and down, right? So the farthest down I use is a -3. Then I go to a -2. Then I don't use anything until I get all the way up here till 3, and I have 2 of those, but again, I don't have to write them twice. And then I have a 5. So this is how I'd write the domain and range if I just had points. Now obviously all of these are not points, these are all lines. So we're going to use one of these two methods. Okay, so for instance, this first one, I'm going to use my interval notation for this one. So interval notation tells me I need to have my lowest value and my highest value of both left and right and up and down. So again, domain, D. Domain is going to be my left and right. So my x values, well, this is my farthest left, and it goes all the way across to my farthest right. So this and this. So my lowest point is going to be, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, -6. And my highest point is going to be a +6. So I count all the way over to a +6. Now notice both of those are solid dots, which means they are included. So that's where I'm going to put my brackets. Remember, if one of those was an open dot, so let's say that this one was an open dot, then I would put a parentheses on this side and a bracket on this side. Okay, let me get rid of this. Okay, so now let's look at our range here. Now again, the range is highest to lowest. So my lowest is right here, and my highest looks right here at the top of my graph. So my lowest, let's see, is 1, 2, 3, -3. And my highest is a +6. I'm going to go ahead and write this one using my inequality. So lowest is -3. Again, because both of those have a dot, I'm going to say less than or equal to x and less than or equal to 6. So it's saying that everything greater than 3 and everything less than 6 is my range. Now these two have arrows. Now this one doesn't really have arrows, but any line that goes off the graph, we're going to assume that there's arrows on there. Don't worry, for the test I will make sure that the pictures actually include arrows if they are meant to include arrows. But for both of these we have arrows. Anytime we have arrows, we know that there is going to be an infinity somewhere in there. So we want to make sure that we use that. So we have interval notation and inequality notation. I'm going to use both of them. So I'll use interval notation for this first one and inequality for the second one. So again, I'm going to look at this and I'm going to say, so for my domain, I'm going to write it down here. So I have my domain and I have my range. Okay, so now I remember, domain is left to right. Well, left, I don't use anything up until here. But then I keep using it because this goes, and it's going to keep going. Those arrows tell me it's going to keep going. So it doesn't stop at this 3. It's going to hit 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and on and on and on. So it starts at -1, but it keeps going. So I can include -1, but then it's going to keep going through infinity. And that's where I would put my parentheses. Okay, so now let's look at our range. Again, our range is from highest to lowest. Well, on this graph, it looks like it stops here and here. But again, those arrows are going to keep going. So it's going to keep going up, and it's going to keep going down, which means it's going to be negative infinity all the way to positive infinity. And again, because it's infinity, we don't know where that ends, so we're going to put our parentheses. So that's how to do interval notation. Now let's look at inequality notation. So on this graph, left and right, again we have arrows, which means it's going to keep going. So it's going to keep going left, and it's going to keep going right, which means there is no end for this graph. So that means it's going to be negative infinity. That's going to be my sorry, we're not going to put our equal to sign because, again, we don't know the ending of that. And then we're going to have our x, and then we're going to have our other sign and our infinity. This would be our domain. As a matter of fact, our range would be the exact same thing. The only difference is, because again, it's going to keep going up, it's going to keep going down, the only difference to the range is we're no longer dealing with x, we are dealing with y. So make sure that you change those variables. Again, when you write it in interval notation, other than the domain and range, there is no variables here. It just tells you your beginning and ending point. But when you write it in inequalities, you have to include the x and the y. That's domain and range. The last thing is graphing a point. This should take only a second because I feel like most of you probably know how to graph a point. This is just review because next chapter we are going to be graphing a lot of lines. Therefore, you need to have a foundation of how to graph a point in order to graph a line. So we're going to find our O value on here. Our O value is right here. Remember, we want to put our x-axis first. Our x comes first, our y comes second. So we're going to look how far left did we go. We went over to -5, and then we went up to a +5. So my answer here should be -5, 5. For P, we went all the way over to 8, and then we didn't go up or down. So we went all the way over to 8, and then we went up and down 0. Okay. Then G, let's see, where's G? Oh, G is way up here. So we went all the way over to 7, and we went all the way up to 8. So 7, 8. And then last but not least, M, which is right here. So we went over to 1 and down to -6. So we went over to 1 and down to -6. hopefully this review helped. If you need more practice, please contact me, and we can set up some time tomorrow to meet before your test on Thursday.